episode of the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. It's a bonus episode of the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Come on now.
This is going to be fun. I've got a friend, an associate here. I've got a bunch of things in common in terms of our background. This is Dr. Steve Bryan. He's a professor of New Testament at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. I don't talk about this a lot around here, but that's where I went to seminary, though I don't think we overlapped. I didn't have any classes with Dr. Bryan. However, we've gotten to know each other over the years, and he's put out a book that I think is very interesting to me. I think it's going to be very interesting to you. It's a book about John, and it's a book that asks, I think, a very important question, and that is, why? You already have three Gospels out there, the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that tell the story of the life and teachings and death and resurrection and commissioning toward the disciples of Jesus. It's very well-covered material. The Jesus stuff was a big deal. But then along comes John, but part of the enchantment of John is that it takes a couple more read-throughs to start to figure out what he's going for and why this gospel exists. So, Steve, you wrote a book. What's the name of the book?
The name of the book is The Visible Word of the Invisible God. So, Visible Word of the Unseen God. So I can't even get the title of my book right, but that's the title of the book. The subtitle is Reading John Among Rivals Old and New. It's a mouthful if you throw in the subtitle, but The Visible Word of the Unseen God.
You know, it's an academic book. They're all mouthfuls, right? Well, let's just cut to the chase. Why did John write John when you've already got three perfectly good versions of the story of Jesus floating around out there and being well received by the early church?
It's a great question, and I think it's a question it's a very old question, a question that goes back to kind of the early centuries of the church. But I do think that John provides some pretty important clues for us. One part of it might simply be the fact that he's just a different dude. He's just got a different way of thinking about things. But I think another is that it's very, very much tailored to an audience who has perhaps met one of the Gospels, or maybe all of the Gospels, probably in a written form, and hadn't been persuaded. If you think about, Jews in the late first century, what's their main objection? And I think it's second commandment. It's the idea that the invisible God, the God who can't be seen, the creator of all things, could take on human flesh. That's a really big pill to swallow if you're coming at this from a Jewish background.
So do you think that John is mostly writing to Jews? And the reason I ask the question is, especially on the front end, it seems like you're seeing a mix of Jewish stuff and Greek stuff. I mean, the heavy lift that the word logos is doing in the opening 18 verses, I mean, you can't ignore that. Surely John is tapping into something there. But also, as a kid, I got taught a lot, like, oh, this is just a very Greek prologue. But then I got a little bit older and I looked through it. Like, well, this is a very Jewish prologue. He's tapping into all kinds of language and concepts from the Old Testament that somebody familiar with the Hebrew scriptures would have been familiar with. So who is he writing to? Is he writing to Greek-minded Jewish people? Is he writing to Greeks and Jews and trying to kill two birds with one stone? Or are we inflicting the Greek stuff on this book and it's not really there at all and this is really for a Jewish audience?
I think he's writing to diaspora Jews. I think, everyone recognizes that the sorts of terms that he uses, like logos, had broad currency in the New Testament. But if you think about whether John is conceptually bilingual, I think the answer to that question is no, he's not both thinking as a Stoic and thinking as someone who is steeped in the Old Testament at the same time. At the end of the day, if you're going to make sense of the Gospel of John, you're going to have to enter into the world of the Old Testament and make sense on those terms. So John is, I think, first and last, an act of scriptural reasoning. reasoning that, that rests for its internal logic on the Old Testament.
So then what is the thrust? What is the argument for John? If he was given the elevator speech to a scattered Jewish reader in the first century, and they're somewhat familiar with the synoptics, and he's like, yeah, they're chatting, and this skeptical Jewish reader is like, well, I've heard about your Jesus, but you got a minute, Buster. Tell me what I'm missing. What would be John's summary based on his gospel?
I guess what I would say is that if the charge that John is effectively refuting is that the incarnation is idolatrous, I think John's basic response to that is it would be idolatrous if Jesus was not God's word who had been made flesh. In other words, if we go back to the scriptural narratives, God has always been present in his word. That is the fundamental premise within the Old Testament. It's what you might think of as the positive form of the second commandment. The negative form of the second commandment is don't make images because I am not present in an image. Don't bow down to them. Don't serve them. I'm not there. One way of reading that is the incommensurability of the creator with the creation. But another way of thinking about it, John's way of thinking about it is to take that in its positive form. Well, where is God? How is God present in the world? And his basic answer to that question is the answer of the Pentateuch, the answer of Exodus and Deuteronomy. God is present in the world in his word. And he always has been. And at Sinai, Exodus 19, Deuteronomy 4, that word becomes visible. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I argue early in the book is that if you change one word of John 1:14, you basically have the thesis statement of the book of Exodus. And so the word that you would have to change is the word flesh. If John 1:14 read, the word became visible and sanctuaried among us, and we beheld his glory, well, that's just the book of Exodus. Because the word comes to Israel at Sinai, visible form. And then the promise, of course, of the rest of the book of Exodus is, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to sanctuary among you. And of course, you have the singular act of rebellion that makes that at least temporarily impossible, the making of the golden calf. And God says, cancel the plan. I can't be with them. But when he does fill the tabernacle with his presence at the very end of the book, and sanctuaries among them, it's the same glory of the Lord that appeared in visible form at Sinai. It is the voice of the Lord, the word of the Lord that appeared in visible form. So the thesis statement of the book of John is effectively a kind of development of the thesis statement of Exodus. That's really what I'm arguing.
Okay. So I'm looking at the subtitle here, Reading John Among Rivals Old and New. And I'm starting to formulate a guess as to who some of those rivals you have in view are, but walk me through it. Who are the rivals old and new?
What I'm trying to argue is that we don't have to guess who the rivals are to early Christian claims about Jesus. We know they're pagans on the one hand, and they're Jews. So we have these three rival groups. So John is supposedly written in Ephesus, even if we don't say Ephesus in particular, but a place like Ephesus. We have this trilateral argument. The debate between these three groups is around one basic question. And that basic question is, how do we know God's here? And the pagan way of answering that question is, I know my God's here because I've got an idol, I've got an image. And then that was being sort of carried over into, emperor worship, let's make this emperor God. The idea that a deity could inhabit human flesh was already kind of being naturalized in that environment. And so I think Jews look at Christians and say, oh, we're just pagans. And John's response is, no. The incarnation is not a violation of the second commandment. It's God keeping it. It's the keeping of the second commandment. God has always been present in his word. And we go back to our founding narratives, Israel meeting God at Sinai and forming a covenant. And this is how God presents himself. This is how God is present with his people in the sanctuary.
When we pick up John and read it today, is it the same rivals that clutter up our brains and our ability to read it? Is it the same rivals, but just in modern form? Or have you found that as history has unfolded and society has evolved, that it just happens to pick a fight with and be a response to new modern rivals?
Downstream of the Enlightenment, God has become a problem, a question. And the question is, how do we know God is here? And the answer is, we don't really know that God is here. We can't know. We can believe, but you can't know. And so that basic question of how do we know God is present? How do we know God is here? How are we going to know God is with us? Is still that's still the central point that's being contested. And maybe arguably it has been throughout the whole of human history. How God is present by thinking about the diffuse reality of spiritual power, spiritual life in stuff, in things, in objects, in nature. And so it's the idea that underwrites image making in ancient world. But you have forms of that idea very, very commonly held today.
So he's making this argument to a very specific kind of person. Most people who are going to pick up and read the Gospel of John or start their journey in the Bible with the Gospel of John are not Jews scattered to the ends of the earth in the first century AD, worried about idolatry as their primary pushback on the reality of Christ and the claims of the gospel. Yet John clearly, he says it more than once, is writing this thing to be persuasive. He wants you to see, he wants you to behold what the deal is. He wants you to see that Jesus is the Son of God and believe, and by believing have life in his name. So does it still apply to the modern reader if they're not Jewish? Is there a different set of lenses that the modern reader should put on to track with John's argument and try to understand, try to see if they can see Jesus properly? Or is it just a book that's so timeless and so well done that it neatly translates from that original audience John was trying to persuade to a modern audience today?
We are individual subjects surrounded by all these objects that we can know in some way, but not really. And so all we're left with is ultimately, in a postmodern frame, is with our own subjectivity. But John has a very different way of imagining what the world is and what God's ultimate purpose is. For John, he invites us to see reality as a sanctuary of divine presence. And that presence is the presence of God in his word. For John, that's his primary image. Destroy this sanctuary and I will raise it up in 3 days. And then in John 14, I'm going to prepare this place with rooms. So the going through crucifixion and resurrection is the preparation of this place for an habitation. We become, as it were, inhabitants of the life of God. So he invites a completely different social imaginary where we are invited inside the life of God. This is not a new idea. It's a very ancient idea, but God is not an object. If your life is inside of his life, and if in one sense you only have life, if you are living the life he gives.
To round things out here, if a normal person like me goes and picks up this book, what would we get out of it?
I think the benefit of reading this book, this basic idea all of us wrestle with, is how do we know God's here? How do we know God's with us? And to see John as someone who's testifying to the reality that God is present in his word. I think if something settles in an average reader from this book, it's what was, the reformers constantly emphasized. God is present in the world, in his word, and by his spirit. And so to think about the nature of God's presence as having always been that way from the beginning of creation, God has always been present in his word. Even before creation, God was present in his word. And so to think about that as a kind of reading rule for the Gospel of John, and to think about that as the reason that we do not worship earthly things. We do not devote our lives to the pursuit of material objects. We worship and serve the Lord God who is present in his word. Our worship of Jesus is our keeping of the second commandment.
Well said. My guest is Dr. Steve Bryan, professor of New Testament at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. The book is called The Visible Word of the Unseen God, Reading John Among Rivals Old and New. Obviously, there will be a link down below so you can go and pick up the book and check it out for yourself. I think we need to do this again. I feel like there are a lot more threads that you and I could be pulling on John and other aspects of the Gospels and the New Testament as well. So I hope this is not our last conversation like this, but thanks for jumping in and processing John with me.
Thank you very much, Matt. Enjoyed it.